Good morning. My name is Jackie Anderson, and I'm the Assistant Dean at the Opus College of Business here at the University of St. Thomas. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our summer online learning series. The purpose of each one of these sessions is to give you the opportunity to start your day with a dose of learning while giving us the opportunity to showcase some of the faculty that teach here within executive education. This is actually the third in our series of 3 this summer, and so this is our grand finale for the summer. But I'm happy to report that demand and interest has been so great that I will be launching the fall online learning series come September. And those topics will include decision making and execution, agile program management and project management, as well as strategic planning in the exponential era. It's going to be a great program. And as you know, our faculty that teach in our online learning series teach in many of our programs. And executive education actually offers over 30 open enrollment programs as well as customized programs. So if there's a specific topic you want to bring to your organization, we'd love to partner with you. So feel free to check out the website, and I would love to see you at St. Thomas. So with that, let me tell you about the plan for this morning. In a minute, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Peter Krembs, who will be talking about polarity management. He'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to leave 5 to 10 minutes for questions and answers. Now, because of the volume of participation in today's webcast, we're going to ask that you submit all your questions via the chat feature in the Zoom app. That way we can queue up the questions. Now, if you have any issues, don't worry. We're recording today's session, and we'll be sending it out after today's experience. So with that then, it is my privilege to introduce our final speaker in our summer online learning series, Peter Krembs, who's going to take us on a journey around polarity management. Now, Peter actually is an adjunct faculty here in executive education, but he spent over 40 years consulting with companies such as Mayo, GE, US Bank. He's considered a thought leader in this specific area. He is the co-author of On the Level, Performance Communication That Really Works, and he received his graduate work in industrial psychology from the University of Minnesota, and his postgraduate work was at the Gestalt Institute in Cleveland, Ohio, where he still teaches today. I can tell you there's none better at creating new clarity and new insights around these leadership concepts. It's my privilege to welcome our final speaker in the 2019 Summer Online Learning Series, Peter Krembs.
Thank you very much, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'd like to welcome you at bright and early at 8 a.m. in the morning. If you're in a different time zone, you may be able to have had your first cup of coffee. Today's topic is about polarities. And what I find is that most people don't exactly know what I'm referring to when I talk about a polarity. So we're going to start by defining what the word means and what that dynamic is. And there's really 3 parts to what we're going to be looking at today. I want to talk a little bit about what polarities are and how do you start to see them. Part of the problem is that particularly in this culture in the US, we're very focused in, we're very good at problem solving. We really like to make very fast decisions based on sizing things up very quickly. And what is required when you start to lead a larger organization, more than just 1 or 2 people, but different groups that are very integrated, you have to kind of get up on the balcony and get away from the details, and then you're in a better position to see these patterns that really have important implications for the decisions that you and your colleagues make. So that's really what we're going to be talking about. And we're really going to talk about, when we talk about working with polarities, we're going to talk about 2 different mindsets, a problem-solving mindset and a polarity mindset. And another way to think about a polarity mindset is and thinking, which is the subtitle for this session. So let's start with defining and starting to see polarities. The interesting thing about polarities is that there's lots of different ways that people refer to this phenomena, and we're not all on the same page in terms of our verbiage. And so I wanted to just put a list out there of what people often refer to that I think is another name for this idea of polarities. One of those words is paradox, because I think on the surface, polarities often look contradictory, but they actually have a way of supporting one another. And that's a very paradoxical kind of a reaction that most people have to that. Chronic tensions, this certainly is a type of tension between two different poles. You know, we see it in government where, you know, the left wing and the right wing become very polarized. And I think that if you're navigating polarities well, you learn how to avoid polarization and get the benefit out of the two sides of the pole supporting one another. But it takes a good sense of insight and a good sense of understanding what the consequences are of mismanaging a polarity. These are often called dilemmas, contradictions, dualities. I think the definition I like is interdependent opposites. So there are things that are innately tied together in a certain way. You can't deal with one part of a polarity and not affect the other. That's what I mean by interdependent. And they're opposites because they look contradictory, even though at further examination they may not be. So my definition is an interdependent pair could be competing values. It could be competencies. We'll talk about leadership skills as pairs, polarity pairs, rather than individual skill sets, which is a different way to think about leadership skills. And I think objectives in an organization can be in tension. For example, we often, with inventory control, you know, the marketing department and the sales department would like to have lots of inventory so that if they sell something, you know, it's right there and the customer doesn't have to wait. On the other hand, the supply chain people have a very different objective. They want a minimum amount of inventory because it's expensive to hold all that inventory, and they're going for efficiency. So how do you find the right balance between sort of lean operating and yet having what you need when you need it? That whole idea of just-in-time kind of thinking and operating comes from navigating a polarity. So there's lots of examples around us in terms of what these things look like. I'm hoping you can read the screen clearly. The point I want to make here is that polarities are everywhere. I always love the word ubiquitous. You know, everywhere you turn, you're dealing with polarities. And again, the key word here is interdependent. Interdependent pairs of, again, values, objectives, skills. And when I say interdependent, what I mean is, again, you have to treat it like a system. You can't isolate part of it and not have unintended consequences. So paying attention to that interdependency is why it's so important to be looking at polarities. So what would be some quick examples? And I think in personal life, in the advertisement for this particular session, we had a couple of personal examples in there. So I want to start there because it applies to your personal life as well as your work life. One of the universal polarities we always wrestle with and will always be present is this tension between what I want and how I want to do things, my autonomy, my agency, if you will, versus the collective and the greater good and what we're in together. Now, sometimes that can be in conflict, but understand polarities don't have to be mutually exclusive. In fact, they're not. I think if we look at it first blush, we'll say, well, if you're in an I mindset, then you can't be doing we. And if you're in a we mindset, you can't be doing I. That's actually not true. I can be very concerned about my autonomy, but in the back of my mind, understand the implications for the people around me, which is really we thinking, right? I can be in a state of we and understand, oh, you know, this group's going to have to make a sacrifice for the whole, and we need to kind of compensate them in some ways or acknowledge their sacrifice, which is I thinking in the background while we is in the foreground. And that's a good example of how you start to think differently when you really understand polarities. Rational and emotional is another one. We often talk about task and relationship. One of the ones I think is really interesting one for parents thinking about raising kids is this question of, you know, should you challenge your kid to make them strive and, you know, get A's, and if they get A's, then get A pluses and constantly be challenging them all the time? Or should we support them, build up their self-esteem, help them see their strengths in terms of what's going on? And we treat these as if you do one, you can't do the other, which is a false choice. And I think the issue here is when people go to read, I don't know, in my day it was Dr. Spock on how to raise your children. There's lots of authors out there. And one will make an argument for one side of that being particularly important. But I think in all cases, you can't only look at one side without having implications on the other. Being totally in the challenge mode ultimately causes a kid to kind of start to lose motivation because they feel like it's never good enough, and I start to lose my desire to learn because I'm never going to be able to grab the golden ring. As soon as I think I'm close, then they move it on me, right? The support side is, if you tell me I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread and I walk on water, I'm going to have a big problem the first time I have a failure because I'm just not prepared for it. And so it's the right ratio, and that ratio changes as kids grow up. Or the oldest child might need a little more support because they're pretty good at challenging themselves, whereas the youngest child might be pretty good at sort of feeling good about themselves. Youngest children often have a lot more of a sense of playfulness and fun, and they really see the value of what they bring to a situation, but maybe don't push themselves as hard as that oldest child. I don't want to over stereotype in terms of birth order, but as you look at each of your kids, they need a different ratio at different times in their process of growing up. So here's some observations about how all polarities work. Polarities are really an energy system, and so there are the two elements of the polarity. And by the way, it doesn't have to be two poles. It could be, and I'm going to invent a word here, it could be a trilarity. There could be three factors that are highly interdependent. There could be a multilarity, is that a word? It's hard to even say, where there's multiple factors that are highly intertwined. In fact, I would say culturally, one of the limitations for growing up in this culture is we like to isolate and zero in on parts of the system rather than thinking in terms of wholes. If you were to go to Asia, or I was just talking, for example, with someone I worked with in one of the programs here at St. Thomas, who happens to have been raised in Sweden. And he's now working for a company here in the US. And we were having lunch actually yesterday. He was saying, I don't understand why people here don't want to be all into the greater good. And I said, that's because you didn't grow up here. If you grew up as an American, it was like individualism, find your own path. Autonomy is good. It's a much preferred mode. Collective things kind of slow you down. In our culture, we tend to look at the collective as driving us to mediocrity, whereas an individual, I can really achieve excellence. That's actually kind of a myth, by the way, but it's a convenient one if you grew up here. If you grew up in Sweden, you think about the whole first, and then you think about yourself second. That's a very different way of operating. If any of you have seen any movies about, the culture clash between the United States and either China, or there was a movie called Crazy Rich Asians, which was a comedy set in Singapore, I believe. And one of the main tensions in the movie is that the American wants to really optimize herself in terms of her professional career, and the potential mother-in-law in the movie says, no, family, it's all about family. And you need to subordinate your individual desires for the sake of the family. Well, that's coming at the world from the other side of that polarity. And if we understand that both are important, we can begin to be creative about how to make those work well together. And that's the whole payoff in terms of this. Polarities always have a predictable flow. It kind of goes from one side to another, and then it kind of comes back on itself. You'll see the little logo in the upper left-hand corner. That infinity loop is sort of the flow that all polarities have. And polarities oscillate. And so you're in a polarity when you move in one direction, and then suddenly there's a pull to go to the other side, and then all that does is want to pull you back to where you started. So we talk about wanting to centralize our company, and we do that, and then people say, This is suffocating. You know, I can't even go out and buy a pencil without going central purchasing. This is like a waste of time. It's inefficient. And so then we decentralize, and then we miss the efficiencies of centralization, and we swing back and forth between centralized and decentralized. Another example of a polarity. The thing to understand about polarities is that they are inherent. I mentioned earlier, they're everywhere. They're indestructible and they're unsolvable. You can't solve a dilemma. You can solve a problem, which might be part of a polarity, but you can't solve a dilemma because it's about finding the right kind of balance to get the most out of both sides of those poles. So in a way, they're unavoidable, unsolvable, indestructible, basically unstoppable. I mean, you can choose not to pay attention to them, but they're still going to be there, and they're still going to impact what goes on around you. But here's the thing. If you see them and you know how to work with them, you can really leverage them. You can make them, the energy work for you. It's sort of like a keto. You know, you use the energy of the other person to achieve your objectives. And you start to see yourselves as a whole, not as an individual facing a foe. This last thing, we can choose not to see polarities, but they're there whether you choose to see them or not. And I think part of the problem here is Americans in particular, we're very good at problem solving and focusing in, move to a higher level of leadership where you're leading a more complex organization. And if you're solving problems at a higher level of leadership, today's solutions are going to become tomorrow's problems because of polarities. It means that if I move in this direction, this is going to start to act up over here, and then we're going to be swinging back and forth, and wide amplitude of swinging between the poles. We see this going on in Congress today, is a colossal waste of energy, and we don't get anything done. And the frustration with Congress is that we're polarized. And what we've got to do is find ways to say, you know, people on the left actually need the thought process on the right, and people on the right need the thought process on the left. And if we balance these in just the right way, we'll have a good long-term sustainable path forward. Here's an example of where I think polarities have an interesting application. Many of you work in an organization where you have a competency model, and you have individual skills that are identified. But actually, leadership skills are effective when they are dealt with as a polarity pair, an interdependent pair of factors. Let's take the first one on the list. Candor. And let's say I'm all about telling the truth. I worked in an organization where they said, we're in the upper Midwest here. Nobody tells the truth. They beat around the bush. So we're going to have random acts of candor. And people went around being candid to people. And the phrase that put chill down people's backs was, well, in the spirit of candor, and you knew you were going to get a punch right in the gut with whatever the issue was. Candor by itself can be dangerous, actually, and doesn't necessarily lead to learning unless I'm concerned about how the receiver takes in my truth. And that's where diplomacy comes in, which another word I would say fits diplomacy the way I mean it here, is to communicate your truth very respectfully, respecting the boundary between you and me, realizing this may be an issue that's more important for me than it is for you, but it's still important. And so by recognizing that, we could have a dialogue about it, and so I can have candor and I can have diplomacy. Diplomacy by itself means I'm going to walk around the truth. And it means I'm going to sugarcoat it. So either one on their own is insufficient. The power comes from how these two work together. Confidence and humility. Confidence without humility is arrogant. Humility without confidence means you're going to hide your talents under a bushel. And I think you can be too humble. And then the organization doesn't know how to access your strengths. Data-driven decisions, instinctive decisions, being directive or participative. You can see all of these are examples of polarities, and I hope these examples help you to start to see them all around you in terms of what we may be working on. Similarly, you could look at objectives, and objectives being in opposition to one another. A very classic example, and again, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, And I think this is a perfect example where really thoughtful leadership around how do we play cost reduction and quality at the same time. So when we reduce costs, we're not sort of damaging the quality of what we're doing. When we build quality systems, we don't overbuild them so they're cumbersome and expensive to implement. Probably the best example that I could use to illustrate this idea of reducing costs and at the same time improving quality. Again, notice it sort of feels like it might be contradictory on the surface, but if you go a little bit deeper, is this idea that in old manufacturing organizations, when I started doing consulting work, there was an engineering department that designed a product, and they threw it over the fence to the manufacturing people, and they had to figure out how to make it. Well, the engineering people wanted a quality product, so they put lots of bells and whistles on it, and then the manufacturing people couldn't produce it with both high quality and efficiency to get the cost out of it, right? So something started to happen, and in my consulting work at GE, this was a very famous initiative called Smart Simple Design, where the design engineers sit with the manufacturing people and they co-create with both points of view in mind. Then you get the benefit of how these could work to the advantage of it's more efficient, it takes cost out, but it actually is easier to make consistently with fewer errors. You could go down all of these objectives and look at how these things could fight each other in terms of being in tension, or if we're thoughtful about bringing the people who really understand both sides of the pole together in the room, and we're open to looking for creative ways of having these work together. In other words, you don't come in with a fixed attachment to my pole of the polarity. You have to be open to hearing what else is possible. And I think that's how we start to really have some breakthroughs. Again, I mentioned this one earlier, but if you treat a polarity as a problem to solve, you create for people you're leading a false choice. It's not decentralized versus centralized. It's where in the organization do we get the most gain for decentralization without a lot of downside? Where are other parts where we need to make an exception to that because autonomy around customizing a product or being able to respond to a particular important client in the firm. Those things we want to make sure we give people that kind of autonomy, but don't miss the opportunities for centralization because we can do both. It's and thinking, not either or thinking. I'm going to just move past these examples. If you get a copy of the slides, you can kind of see the examples. But the answer to the question, should we be centralizing or decentralizing, is yes, which I think to most people is a little confusing. But if you have a polarity mindset, it's not. So what do we mean by working with polarities? If you can start to see these and you really see the energy system that's going on between them, I think this gets into a need, and this is kind of what I'm bringing to this in terms of some of my work, is this idea of contrasting what does a problem-solving mindset look like? Because there are, in fact, problems to solve, and we need that problem-solving mindset. It's a good thing, right? But there's also a polarity management or polarity navigation mindset, which thinks differently. And so as a leader, you need both, and you need the skill of knowing when to shift back and forth between a problem-solving mindset or a polarity mindset. So a couple of quick characteristics of a problem-solving mindset. It tends to isolate symptoms into something to fix. Notice it immediately goes zero in, which takes it out of the context. Once I'm out of the context, I can't even see the polarities, much less deal with them. And, you know, for me, I want to zero in because I don't want any distractions. Complexity is distracting, but it's a distraction worth paying attention to because it can really take a great solution and turn it into a lot of unintended negative consequences. I think this idea that problem solving fits everything assumes that there's an ideal solution to any set of symptoms, when in fact there's always multiple solutions, and we end up picking what has the best overall effect. Values in terms of problem-solving mindset is this focus-in thing. I often talk about the need to get up on the balcony, and I often use this analogy in my classes when I teach. of, some days, not only can you not see the forest, right? But you're so close to the trees that you have like bark lines on your forehead. And again, I think part of the reason we need good expert problem solvers working in tandem with leaders who are a little more on the balcony is that together they have the whole map. Separately, they only have part of it. And I think this is why collaboration is so critical in complex organizations. By the way, problem solving is a pretty linear process. It's from a problem to a solution, right? Let's contrast that with a polarity mindset. Again, it requires getting up on the balcony. It encourages people to anticipate consequences before jumping to a conclusion that, oh, this is a great solution, right? We stop and we pause and say, okay, if we do this, what would be move 2 or 3 or 4 on the chessboard as a result of that choice? And as we start to think about it, you begin to see, oh, that may cause us to circle back, and we get caught in a loop here, going back and forth if we're not careful. And I think it causes people also, and this is a very important strength, if you look at a lot of the research work on adaptive leadership, how do organizations adapt quickly to changing circumstances? If you have a polarity mindset, you find the right way to balance it for right now. It's like the right balance between support and challenge for one of your kids when they're 7. Now they're like 14. And you need you got to rejigger the balance to have it work effectively. And so you're constantly in an adaptive mode. So it calls on people to revisit how we are leveraging the polarity, and it may have worked fine in the past, but now the conditions have changed and we've got to rethink it or maybe make some adaptations to it, right? So both mindsets had value, both are needed. And I think that's pretty critical. Now, on the face of it, you might think, well, if this is so powerful, why do people fight it? And I think part of the reason is if I'm in a problem-solving mindset and you want to talk about polarities, I'm going to roll my eyeballs and say, wake me up when this meeting's over because I just want to go fix it. My need to kind of go right in to action is going to cut off the kind of dialogue that would cause us to think through this polarity and the implications. I think another problem is that we design organizations with specialist groups. And then we say, well, okay, we got a leader up here who can take these 2 groups who need to work together. Remember the inventory, the supply chain folks, and then the sales people. Let's say that I'm at a higher executive level and I got both of these groups, and I want to say, we need both of you and you need to work together. But I've set the whole system up to say to the supply chain people, just focus on your stuff, stick to your knitting, right? You just focus on sales. Don't worry about how we do the supply chain stuff. And we tell them that they don't need to get on the balcony because I'll do it for you. That has some consequences. And part of the problem is if I'm sitting in group A and pole A really pays off for me what I want, and there are some negative consequences at pole B that maybe another group worries about, I can just say, not my problem. Have you ever heard that? And it gets really hard to get people brought forward. My colleague from Sweden said, I'm so frustrated, why can't we just put on the same uniform, we're all peers in the room, put it shoulder to shoulder and do this for the greater good. And again, what I'm saying is that doesn't optimize me as an individual enough if that is a strong preference for me. If I don't have a strong sense of we, it's kind of a hard sell to get me to do it. And what you'll see in most organizations is they say, okay, I know you don't like this, but buck up, cupcake, because this is life. And you're just going to have to do it this way because the system needs you to do it this way. And then you get this reluctant sort of, well, all right, if I have to, but you feel that resistance because they're not embracing it, right? I think another assumption around people that are very problem-solving oriented is they seek to want to balance tensions, instead of seeing that it could lead to a creative option, they think, well, that's just compromise. And any kind of compromise is going to lead us to mediocrity. And again, that's a very biased point of view from I want to optimize myself perspective. And if you really look at the power of collaborative work, there are sometimes, if it's a committee and we just sort of say, well, what's the last idea standing, you will get mediocrity. So that is a possibility. But if we're really committed to exploring this tension and the possibilities of how we play the hand, we can actually do something that's better than anything we've done in the past, and actually satisfies both sides, because now, instead of being in conflict, these poles are actually supporting each other. I think that there's some very specific leadership skills that you need to develop if you're going to work with polarities well. One is the art of framing it as a polarity, not a problem to solve. So if I start a discussion by saying, you know, we have two options. We've got A, we've got B. Which one do you want? It's sort of like telling a 3-year-old, you know, would you like, which outfit would you like? Would you like the red one, the blue one, the green one, the yellow one? Go pick something. Well, if any of you have had a little kid in your life, that's a disaster. You know, what you need to do is kind of bound it up. It's red or blue. You know, you get choice A or B. That's it, right? And the adult frames it as a simpler problem so as not to overwhelm the child, right? Well, analogously, in an organization, if I only have a view of one part of the organization because of where I sit, I need someone to help me frame an issue, not just in terms of what affects me, but what the interdependent sort of reactions and kind of bouncing off the sides of the pool table, what are going to be those reactions that I also have to take into account, or my good work is going to be going down the drain. And again, the appeal is, if you want your ideas to be sustainable, we have to really look at the consequences of what those ideas will create. Seeing these patterns is a skill set. It's called pattern recognition. Do I only see problems to solve, or do I see sort of these interdependencies, and maybe I haven't quite cracked the code of what to do with it, but I really get that these two things are going to be like magnets, kind of, you know, either repelling if they're in contradiction, or supporting one another and really sticking in terms of the long-term effect. And finally, it encourages groups to anticipate unintended consequences. The last thing is, if you have and thinking, it doesn't cut off innovation and creativity. If I decide that it's either A or it's B, and there really is no middle ground, I've taken off the table a possibility of what could A and B together do that none of us have thought of yet, because we haven't invented it. And I think the number of times through our, you know, dualistic thinking, or there's a right way or a wrong way, we eliminate the crucible that really leads to more innovative thinking. So try to put that into context of what this works. One visual way to kind of make polarities come to life is something called mapping polarities. I want to give sort of the right kind of bow to Barry Johnson. He wrote a book called Managing Polarities. It's maybe about 20 years ago. It's still a great book for understanding polarities. You can get it on Amazon if you look up Barry Johnson, Managing Polarities, right? He has a new book coming out, but it hasn't been published yet. I've gotten to see a couple of chapters, so I'm really excited. And the book is called And, just the word and, which is, I think, a clever way to title it. So you might want to be watching for that. I don't think it's going to come out this year, but maybe next year. So what are the key components of building a map? And this has usefulness if I'm sitting in a group meeting and we've got a big, you know, sort of, we can map out the tensions. So we're not trying to solve it in any way. We're just first trying to understand it, and trying to understand it together, which is very critical if we're going to work it together, right? And so, you know, again, it starts with, what are the core elements that are in tension? Centralized, decentralized, continuity, disruption. And I think it names that underlying tension that creates the polarization on any particular topic. You'll know it's a polarity when you see some of these kind of elements, that there's just no satisfying solution. We do this and it's just, yeah, well, that checks off these things, but here's the problem with that. And then we go over here and say, well, that gives us those things that we're missing with the other solution, but you know what? That's got, you know, I wish I could get both. Is there a way to get both? That's polarity management. The problem keeps resurfacing over and over again. It's kind of like, something pops up and then it kind of goes back under the surface for a while, but it just keeps popping up. And even though we've been treating it, it just doesn't seem to abate. This is a clue that to continue to treat it as a problem to solve is actually going to be a colossal waste of energy. You need to stop and saying, this isn't working. and again, get up on the balcony. Is there another way to think about this so we don't keep recreating a problem that puts us right back where we started? Increasingly, big swings back and forth, again, are one of the things that you want to minimize when you are really managing polarities or leading with this polarity mindset. We can do, little kind of swings back and forth, but if we keep it tighter, we see more of the possibilities of how we could refine it more and more, and we're not wasting that energy going to one extreme and then going to the other extreme. I think it's not an accident that after the Tea Party formed, a lot of the courage and assertiveness around the very far left started getting more active. And I think what happens is that when people see one side as an extreme starting to develop, I say, well, we're going to get sucked right down there. It's slippery slope, We better set this way over here so they don't get too far out. And then we get into a battle of, well, it's either this ideology and that ideology, and there's no pragmatic solution that's really going to satisfy the whole. So here's what the map would look like if you're doing a problem-solving mindset. It's from this problem to a solution. Got it? Inside a polarity are problems to solve. So this next map shows all we're doing is naming the poles in the yellow oval and the blue oval, right? But we've now shifted to say there's some things we're seeing as symptoms that call for change, and so that's the from, and we're going to go to a better choice. So we're going to kind of experiment with that. Now, if you stop there, you're going to miss what happens in terms of the follow-through with that great idea. And so what begins to happen is we start to see, well, if I go from the symptoms today and I go to this solution, we're going to miss some of the advantages of the old way of doing that. And those are going to start to show up because we're not attending to them. So we come around to the bottom of the circle, and then we're right back to the top, and then we're just focusing back on ourselves. Very critical. And I think this is sort of a really good universal point for anyone in a leadership role. You need to be able to anchor the reason for addressing this polarity into a greater good that we've all bought into. So if we have a clear vision, or we are a mission and purpose organization, at the Mayo Clinic, we heal the sick while we advance the science. It's pretty succinct, it's pretty clear, and we are all in terms of being able to do that. So that when we do have a tension between, what the insurance side of the business wants versus what the delivery people want, what patients want in terms of a seamless experience versus specialists, that I don't want to work on teams, I want to work alone. And that's not going to create a seamless experience. What allows the forum to begin to find what's the right way we can give people what they need to do their jobs well, but not miss an opportunity to really advance the greater good. So this anchor in a greater good is the rationale for why we want to look at the polarity and work with it. Some polarities are not worth working. They're just a fact of life, and we live with them, and that's as far as it goes. But when it's really critical to what we're about, what our purpose is, then it becomes really important we create that dialogue, create a map so everybody can see it. Now, at the bottom of the map is really an interesting sort of polarity in itself. So we get excited about this greater good, and then we stick our neck out in that direction. We say, oh my God, this is new territory, I'm a little nervous, right? And so then we kind of recoil a little bit because there's a little bit of anxiety. I'm not sure this is going to go very well. What if this experiment about to do this flops? Maybe this will be the end of my career. There's all kinds of things that cause me to kind of pull back a little bit. And it's actually the tension between the greater good and the anxiety of going down that path that is a polarity that is part of what this map is all about. So if you look at this map, again, you'll see the from and to from the problem-solving mindset. And what I'm saying is, just sort of shift that. So the from is, we got some symptoms here we don't like. Let's go to a different response, which is the upper right-hand corner. And again, part of what's motivating that movement to the upper right-hand corner is the fact that I'm feeling really anxious with this. This is not working for me. And I'm spending a lot of time kind of dealing with things that are not the main point of why we're here. And so how do we streamline this? How do we make it less intimidating to deal with, right? So here's an example. And I think this is actually kind of what happened in the 2016 election, is a lot of people were saying, gee, you know, the last, you know, I don't know, 5 or 6 sort of 4-year administrations of presidents we've had, both Republican and Democrat, are kind of same old, same old. It's kind of the same way we've done it. Now, the advantage to that is it's a very stable, predictable system. But there's kind of this sense of, you know, I'm not really a player in this, so I kind of like this to be blown up so that I can make space for myself. Or it feels like we're naming all the problems, but we're not really motivated to kind of work on them. We're kind of in a state of stagnation. And people have kind of lost their energy because of the bureaucracy and kind of getting caught in it. And if you'll notice, one of the things that a lot of the pundits are talking about cause people to go with a particular candidate that was running for president was saying, you know, what have I got to lose? Maybe this should be blown up a little bit. Let's try a little disruption. This guy seems good at disruption. And, you know, be careful what you ask for, because not only do you get some disruption, you can get a lot of disruption. So the good news is that disruption creates some new energy, a new direction. It sort of is a crucible maybe for some creativity or to tap into some new wisdom. But eventually, too much of that starts to create the downside on the other elements. So understand, stagnation, loss of energy, missed opportunities, problems, fears that I don't want. So I move to a solution, right? Well, let's look, and we have a strategy for getting there, right? Let's look at the other side of this polarity map, because if we're at the bottom of disruption and change, you know, I miss the continuity. I miss the predictability of things. It's like every day it's fruit basket upset and I'm anxious all the time. You know, it's a little too much. You know, dial it down a little bit, right? And so we maybe don't feel we can get traction on our core values, or we feel like maybe we're taking foolish risks just for the sake of experimentation, but they're not thoughtful risks. They're not really you know, real advances. They're just more reactionary things because we're in this overwhelmed state. So again, what happens? You know, our new solution to how to run the country starts to create some new problems and fears. We get a strategy, and guess what? The answer is right where we started. Continuity, core values, tapping the past, that's stability. And so the more I understand that we're in a doom loop here, and we could do this forever and not get anywhere, that's, you begin to say, okay, have you hit your head against the brick wall enough? Because maybe we should try something different. We start to map this and we say, how do we really, and again, this is my final slide here, how do we, and if you see the gray arrows are kind of more at the top of the chart, they're more the positive outcomes of stability mixed with the positive outcomes of change. How can we get these to live together, to actually support each other and create a stronger path forward, rather than fighting the negative things, not letting them get to that point before we start to exert some change. So what happens is that everybody in the room who's looking at this starts to understand the bigger picture, the complex interdependencies, and how to really leverage those to really work effectively. So I'm going to bring this to a close. We've kind of talked about what a polarity is, how do you see them. We've kind of talked about how you work polarities, how do you use that energy effectively. We call it leveraging polarities. And then finally, this idea of visually mapping them so we can all get on the same page and together look at this from the same side of the table.
All right. Great presentation, Peter. Thank you. I'm not going to let you go too far, though.
Okay.
I need you to answer some questions. We got
Sure.
several questions. My goal, always when we do these online learning series, is to get you out about 5 minutes before. So if you have a 9 o'clock meeting, you can make it. But I'm gonna pelt you with some questions,
That's
Peter.
great.
All right. Could you comment on how this plays out if there are two teams that merge during a time of change? How can they leverage interdependencies to create a culture to sustain both?
That is a great question. And again, understand that the underlying polarity, the pattern that you really want to see, is the power of being apart or a subgroup and the power of a whole. And if we've been merged, the power of being a subgroup is way stronger than any sense we have as a whole. And so there is no greater good that would be an incentive for me to say, I need to let go of what I'm attached to and be open to maybe a new way of thinking things. I just want to tell a very brief story about his, if you allow me. I was working in a workshop, and there were some people from Boeing, and at the time they had just merged with McDonnell Douglas. So McDonnell Douglas and Boeing had just merged, right? And one of the people, one of the leaders in the class said, you know, years later you can still see, who came from what legacy organization, and it almost takes a whole generation before you get past that, when you can start with a blank sheet of paper. And I said, well, it hasn't been that long since the thing. I said, oh, no, I'm not talking about McDonnell Douglas and Boeing. I'm talking about McDonnell and Douglas, which is like from the 40s, right? So I think, part of this is to understand, once we get deeply embedded in a pole way of thinking, our group is better. We're smarter, we're faster, that dualistic thing. If we're separate, then one's up and one's down. One's good, one's bad. That's how we get stuck into polarization. And I think part of it is preventing that from happening. So what's the best that this side has to offer? What's the best that this side has to offer? How do we create something new that didn't exist before? And again, I can't even get your attention until I get you to let go of the past. So it's a great question. I wish I had a silver bullet answer, but it is a polarity to navigate.
And on that same theme, I work in an organization that relies on quality customer service.
Yep.
How do you balance limited resources and keeping a high standard of customer service?
Oh, yeah, great. So I want to say a phrase, and people out there listening to this have probably heard this many times before, and it's kind of just makes you roll your eyeballs. When, it comes to budget cutting time, the leadership vision is, we're going to do more with less. And then it stops. They don't give you a pathway of how to do more with less. They just say, go figure it out, right? And I think it's the work of leadership to kind of sit down and say, how do we take what customers care about most and preserve that? Maybe there's some things we're doing that we think is good customer service, but frankly, the customers don't care. This is happening in the hotel industry where, people are saying, well, you need to have a big, luxurious lobby. Today's worker wants a good space to put out their laptop, and they don't want frills. They want, make food easily accessible. I'm going to need my martini because I've had a heck of a day, and then I want to get my work done. That's what I want. I don't need fancy and sumptuous. And so we can build a more lean kind of hotel for less cost and actually do a better job of serving the client by really understanding what is the side that's pulling that pole that's worth hanging on to, what's worth letting go, and that's where we put the cuts.
Great. The concept of a false choice is critical, but how can you suggest a solution is a false choice without offending the person potentially offering it?
Yes, right. So again, understand that when somebody's offering a false choice in terms of your experience on the receiving end, they don't see it as a false choice. They're framing it as we're going to choose because that's the only way to solve this problem and move forward, right? So you're in different frames. If I talk to you out of my frame and you talk to me out of your frame, we're not going to meet. And I think that's what gets really frustrating. And I think part of what I would recommend, this is what I would think would work, would be to say, well, we could look at this as a choice, but I'd like to maybe frame this a little differently, because maybe these aren't exactly at odds. Maybe we take a little of this and a little of that and come up with something. And of course, the response, the resistance that comes back is, we don't have time. We got to make a choice. We got to make a decision today. And I think the response back is to say, okay, well, we can do that today, but let's hold on to the idea of experimenting with this, because maybe there's another way to play this. And we're trying to expand the view of the possibilities. You have to do that very diplomatically. You can be candid, but with diplomacy. Remember what we said earlier. And I think it's the idea of encouraging experimentation rather than being locked into, okay, we're at the finish line, let's go across the finish line, saying, let's talk about the whole race. And how did we get here from here, Again, easier said than done. I think it requires some patience, and it requires a leader to say, okay, maybe we need to do this today because we're under the gun, but let's use this as an opportunity, because this is going to come up again, to maybe try something different. Let's start earlier to prepare a different choice.
Great, great. Now I have several more questions, but I'm going to ask you one last one before we wrap up here. My organization recently centralized, and we are feeling the downside of that polarity.
Yes, right.
How, as an individual contributor, can I influence? I'm not the leader.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what happens in most organizations. If you don't have a lot of leverage in terms of the larger system, either leaders or other peers who are opinion leaders in the organization, what will actually happen, and again, I'm not recommending this, is that the individual worker will just go stealth. They'll say, oh, we'll go through the motions of all this centralization stuff, but secretly, I'm going to go do it my way, And you'll see that a lot with high achievement-oriented technical folks. It's like, stop bugging me with all this bureaucracy and let me do my job, right? And you want to do all this stuff, and all I see that is wasted effort in terms of what's going on. And I think, part of the reason we get into that mode is that the leaders make these choices without helping people get up on the balcony and understand why, and maybe begin to see, and again, it's the why behind the what is missing. If I could say what's the number one thing that leaders in this country fall down on, is they're not good at painting a picture of the why. Why does this matter that we do more centralization? At Medtronic, they went from individual platforms to design products, and then they said, if we have all these products, we don't have the resources to support all these. So we're going to limit this to 3 fundamental platforms. And you know what? If it doesn't fit one of those 3 platforms, we're not going to do it. And boy, the engineers went nuts, because, well, what about my creative idea? And again, I think part of it is to say, when we're small and there's lots of room for experimentation, it's different than when we're big and we've got to sustain ourselves. How do you help people see that side of the polarity when they're sitting in their bunker somewhere? So, I don't know.
Great. Well, Peter, I can't thank you enough for wrapping up this year's 2019 Summer Online Learning Series. Peter actually is a lead faculty in our St. Thomas Executive Program, which kicks off on September 25th. I think we have 2 spots remaining. So if you're interested in a 9-day leadership development program targeting senior managers and above, we'd love to see you here at St. Thomas.
And by the way, polarities are a key topic.
And polarities are included in that work as well. Also, I want to mention briefly the Fall Online Learning Series. You will be seeing more details about that coming soon. But briefly, our first session is September 18th, and it's titled Decision Making. It's with Leo Hoff. Leo actually teaches these skills at Stanford, and being a Minnesota native, he's coming back and working with us. The second session is November 5th, and it's Agile Project Management with Wayne Call. And then finally, our third session is titled Strategic Planning in the Exponential Era with Michael Wright. It's sure to be another great series. Well, thank you again for joining us this summer. We hope you enjoyed this year's topics, and I hope you get a chance to enjoy the remaining dog days of summer. Thank you. Have a great day.